Dr. Kaszniak is a professor of psychology, neurology, and psychiatry here at the University of Arizona. He's had a very distinguished career, which has included being a co-author of 7 books and publishing more than 150 journal articles and book chapters. And he's also currently the Chief Academic Officer for the Mind and Life Institute. And in addition to doing all of these things, he has kindly served as AMRIG's faculty advisor since the organization's inception in 2008. And he is also a lineage holder and teacher, sensei, in the Soto tradition of Zen Buddhism. So now I'll turn it over to Al. Thank you so much for being
For the
here.
kind words. I think mostly I'm moving toward an extinguished career. So I'm going to try to address a set of questions today, beginning with this difficult one of what do we mean by this word self? And then secondly, how is it understood from a Buddhist perspective, because I'm going to use that framework to cast how we go about looking at some related neuroscience, and specifically I want to address how the notion of self may be related to what Buddhism calls dukkha, or we might translate as unsatisfactoriness. I'm going to talk a bit about how neuroscience may contribute to our understanding of the self, and specifically about how neuroscientific studies of meditators may give us some better understanding of the relationship of meditation to self. And then I'm going to wrap it up with looking at how meditation might itself change the experience of self. So first of all, I think most of you have some sense of what we mean when we use this word self, our common understanding of it. And that is as a given, that is we simply take it for granted, unique, each different from the other, integrated and cohesive, that is our various parts we feel hang together, and independent, that is what I define as self, what's contained within this membrane of skin, different from what's contained within yours, and also relatively permanent. And that this somehow is underlying the flow of our experience, or we think of ourselves as having experiences. Okay? That, I think, is a fairly common way of understanding self within our culture. And certainly within various earlier philosophic and many of our religious traditions, there's the supposition that we possess both bodies and souls, and that souls are the essence of self. So again, that term soul taking on some of the same characteristics that I just described as a common sense definition of self. Now, the Four Noble or Ennobling Truths in Buddhism, which tends to take a rather different view of the self, start off with dukkha, the truth of unsatisfactoriness, often translated as suffering, but I think that tends to connote a severity of discomfort that probably wasn't intended in what the Buddha initially described. Unsatisfactoriness, perhaps a better way of thinking about it. And the second noble truth, that there is an arising or origin of dukkha that has to do with craving or clinging to various things and states. The third, that there is the possibility of cessation of dukkha, and I want to focus particularly here on the role of transforming a delusive sense of the self and how that may be related to reducing this craving and clinging that I described in that second noble truth. And then finally, of course, the Eightfold Path, a path to liberation from dukkha. Within the Dhammapada, translation here by Gil Fronsdal, the Buddha reportedly said the following: "House builder, you are seen. You will not build a house again. All the rafters are broken, the ridgepole destroyed, the mind gone to the unconstructed has reached the end of craving. The metaphor of house he's using here to describe self. And so a couple of important components of this. Number one, the constructed nature of self. That's one of the things the metaphor is communicating. Second, that there is a deconstruction of that self that's possible. And third, that that deconstruction has something to do with the end of craving. These are basic principles within Buddhist philosophy and, of course, the practice that instantiates it. Non-self is a very central concept in Buddhist teaching. Anatman is the Pali word. And what this particular concept entails is that no self exists in the sense of a permanent, eternal, integral, and independent substance within an individual existence. So in other words, it counters that common sense definition of self. Rather, it poses that the self is transitory, changeable, and therefore, and here's the linkage to unsatisfactoriness, suffering prone. And that self really is constructed from what Buddhism calls the five aggregates. And those aggregates, or skandhas, heaps, could be another translation for it, are familiar to all of us. They include corporeality or form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness itself, in which all the rest of that is arising. So when we sit in meditation, for example, and simply watch what arises in the mental continuum, this pretty well describes everything that's there, right? What else would there be? Besides forms, sensation, perception, mental formations like concepts, and this field of consciousness in which these are arising. So an author like David Loy, who was here in Tucson and speaking to our Upaya Sangha of Tucson on Saturday, said the following in his book, Money, Sex, War, Karma. My sense of self is composed of mostly habitual ways of perceiving, feeling, thinking, and acting, these skandhas. If you strip away those psychological and physical processes, what's left? Nothing. My nothingness means that my constructed sense of self is ungrounded. So it's haunted by a basic sense of unreality and insecurity. So here he's drawing that linkage even more tightly between this constructed sense of self and our general experience of unsatisfactoriness in life, that first noble truth. There really isn't anything solid that's there. And so our efforts to depend upon or rest within our sense of self fundamentally ungrounded. And so therefore, this kind of basic unsatisfactoriness. Mathieu Ricard, in his 2003 book, Happiness, goes on to add to this, saying that as we begin to feel that this self is highly vulnerable and must be protected and satisfied, aversion and attraction come into play. Aversion for anything that threatens the self, and attraction to anything that pleases, comforts, boosts its confidence, or puts it at ease. So again, that linkage between this constructed sense of self and our craving and aversion, contributing to that unsatisfactoriness, because none of those are able to provide us with the satisfaction of those cravings or enactment of those aversions, not able to bring any kind of happiness that's lasting or stable. Within the research literature on related topics, one of the observations that has come up in a number of studies is that self-focused perspective taking that is tending to see the world entirely through my own lenses how it seems to me, rather than being able to shift perspective and see it as though it were through another's eyes, that self-focused perspective taking tends to arouse more intense empathic distress. So the argument was made by Batson and supported by a number of his studies that when we reverberate with another's suffering, and that seems to be a capacity that is built in for us. There's a whole other story we can talk about having to do with what's been called a perception action system, our mirror neuron system that enables us to utilize the same mind-body processes that we would if we were enacting a particular movement when we observe that same movement in others. So it's a kind of built-in reverberation with others, and because of linkages between that system and the emotion systems of the brain, mind, body, we reverberate affectively with others. That seems involuntary. We don't have to intentionally instantiate that. It operates automatically. But whether that gives rise to empathic concern for another individual, and then with other factors added on, compassion, not only empathic concern, but the desire to be of aid to another person who's suffering, or empathic distress, becoming so aroused by having it feel as though it were our emotional experience, that difference can affect the degree to which that kind of basic empathy either does or does not translate into altruistic action. When the arousal of empathic distress occurs, particularly when it's of sufficient intensity, it looks as though most of the time what we do is something that's self-focused, that tries to reduce that arousal. And that may involve turning away from the suffering of others, or it may involve other kinds of self-focused activity that reduce that arousal. Those activities may not be in the service of reducing the suffering of that other individual. There's also a literature that relates all of this to attachment style. Various factors, particularly parental affection and instruction, having to do with such things, for example, as materialistic values, have been related to whether in adulthood we manifest either a sense of secure attachment, we feel we can count on those we are close to be there for us, to be supportive of us, or insecure attachment that manifests either as avoidant attachment style, where we push away relationships because they're not trustworthy, or anxious attachment style, where we're constantly vigilant for the risk of losing that support and relationship. Those two variations of insecure attachment have been related to a reduction in compassionate experience and also a reduction in the likelihood of engaging in altruistic behavior. So, again, the way in which we construe our sense of self, not only related to our own personal sense of unsatisfactoriness, but also to the degree to which we're able to behave compassionately, altruistically with others. And I'll come back to that again toward the end of the talk. One of perhaps the most articulate of teachers in the Buddhist tradition about the nature of self-experience and the relationship of that to meditation practice was Eihei Dogen, the founder, or one of the two founders of the Soto tradition of Zen in Japan, who in an often quoted passage from the Genjo Koan, meaning actualizing the fundamental point. And this, by the way, was written as instruction to a lay practitioner written sometime in the middle portion of the 13th century. What Dogen wrote was the following: to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by a myriad things. When actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So what the heck is he talking about? To study the Buddha way is to study the self. But then he goes to study the self is to forget the self. What does that mean? I think he's referring to this constructed sense of self. And that when we drop into raw sensory experience, I think that's what he means by being actualized by myriad things. Experiencing the sensory world as it is, rather than through the lenses of self-relevance, what it means to me and my needs and hierarchies. That in doing so, the kind of self that we imagine ourselves to have, that's independent, this constructed self that we feel to be relatively permanent, in its bodily and its mental aspects, feels as though it's falling away, it drops away. And simultaneous with that, we're having an experience that the same thing is true for others. That they're not this kind of self we imagine ourselves to be or to have. Okay? And then the last part of it, that it's not a conceptual transformation. This is where he says no trace of realization remains. It's not an intellective process. It simply is a kind of coming to our senses. So what does meditation have to do with that deconstruction of self? Well, Loy again argues that this illusory sense of self is deconstructed by directly experiencing its emptiness. And we have to be a little careful about this term within Buddhism, because it can have connotations that I don't think are intended by it. What emptiness means in this context is simply that there's a lack of some essential nature. Emptiness simply refers to all being interdependent, persons and things alike. Nothing that stands alone in and of itself. So that everything that arises, everything that manifests, is interdependent and in fact codependently arising, each influencing each other. When we sit in meditation practice, and various kinds of practices can give rise to this, we'll talk a little bit about specifically mindfulness practice in just a bit. But when we sit in that practice, we can begin to directly experience that emptiness. So any experience that arises in the mental continuum, we begin to see its linkages to everything else. There isn't anything that's irreducible, nothing that stands on its own, everything interrelated, and that's particularly true of those things that we have previously identified as self. And he goes on to say that when we let go of habitual physical and mental activity that distracts us from that emptiness, that's the stillness of meditation practice, sitting with it and as it, that's fundamental to how it is that practice is transforming this sense of self. With mindful observing of mental activity, there begins to be a shift in the sense of self. The self starts to be deconstructed. That is, it's found to be a psychological construction built simply of a continuously changing flow of concepts, images, sensations, beliefs, those skandhas. And those aggregates that we once thought to be something that comprises a stable self, are eventually seen to be impermanent, always changing. So that's a rather different way of experiencing self. Nothing that's solid, independent, permanent, constantly changing, codependently arising. So what does neuroscience, if anything, contribute to this? Sometimes I think relatively little. But there are a few things that I think are helpful when we're looking for cognitive scaffolding for understanding some of this. And I want to say, just very briefly, something about my own view of this relationship between neuroscience and contemplative practice. I don't think that neuroscience or other aspects of science are necessary to prove aspects of contemplative practice and experience. Those stand on their own. They have a first-person reality. Third-person observations of science, not necessary. But of course, we're cognitive creatures. And we look for ways to be able to communicate with each other, and sometimes it's just fun to talk about. And so observations that come from third-person perspectives of science, I think, can be useful in giving us a kind of perspective about this deconstructing of the self. And so I'm going to talk about two domains of research, one of them being studies of persons who have brain pathology that alters self-awareness, because they begin to point at particularly relevant brain systems. And the other then, neuroimaging, particularly functional neuroimaging studies of healthy persons who are put into experimental conditions that manipulate self-awareness. And both of these, as we'll explore, seem to converge on a particular story. So, for a period of time in my own laboratory, we've been rather concerned with self-awareness of cognitive functioning, particularly of memory. And this grew out of clinical observations in my own clinical neuropsychologic practice, suggesting that individuals who had the same severity of memory impairment, depending upon the etiology of that memory impairment, might differ considerably in the degree to which they were self-aware of that memory impairment. Some being quite acutely aware of it, others seemingly almost completely unaware of it. And so when former graduate student Jasmeet Panu and I surveyed the related literature, what we found was that there were a set of diseases that consistently manifested with underawareness or unawareness of that memory impairment. And they included Alzheimer's disease, memory impairment due to human immunodeficiency, virus infection, multiple sclerosis, Huntington's disease, Korsakoff syndrome, and also traumatic brain injury. And what all of these have in common is structural evidence of damage that involves the frontal lobes of the brain, and also significant correlation between memory self-awareness and indices of frontal lobe function, some of them physiologic, some of them behavioral. Now, we also engaged in a series of studies, just one example here, of individuals who had focal damage involving various areas within the frontal lobes, and we relied primarily on studies of persons who had strokes, where depending upon the particular cerebral artery that was affected, there would be damage within various different areas of the frontal lobes. And when we applied structural neuroimaging and compared lesion locations for those patients with strokes who showed what we called feeling of knowing congruence, that is, I won't go through the detail of the feeling of knowing paradigm, but it's basically a way of determining whether individuals do have an accurate sense of their memory functioning by virtue of how accurate they are at predicting their recognition memory for things that we show them. Okay? Fairly simple paradigm. We just look at the congruence between what they predict they're going to remember and what they actually do remember. So those individuals who had very little awareness of their memory impairment by that kind of an index, more than 2 standard deviations outside of expectation for healthy normal controls, demonstrated lesion overlap that was in the right medial prefrontal cortex, just shown in the blue there. So that began to focus our attention in that particular area of the brain. And then in both some of the work that Jasmeet Panu did, for example, in her dissertation study, and a growing body of literature that Legrand and Ruby summarized in 2009, functional neuroimaging studies, both PET scan as well as fMRI, began to support a role of the medial prefrontal, particularly on the right side, precuneus, posterior cingulate, and temporoparietal junction, as well as the anterior temporal cortices, in a kind of narrative self-referencing. That is the way in which we develop not only awareness of, but stories about self. And that links our subjective experiences across time. That gives us a sense that there's some stability to this experience of self. It involves self-projection, memory for the past, anticipation of the future, all of which dependent upon this construction of a sense of self. In another body of literature, looking at what happens functionally in the brain when individuals are not engaged in a particular task, a set of intercorrelated brain structures, particularly involving the frontal and parietal areas, mostly medially, became known as the default mode network. Default, that is, what we seem to default to when we're not engaged in some particular task. And as was pointed out by Buckner and Carroll in 2006, that default mode network, and these are the areas involved in it in frontal and parietal, again mostly medial cortices, looked very similar to what was seen in tasks that requested individuals to remember something about the past, episodic memory tasks, tasks that required prospection, projecting into the future, tasks that required perspective taking and discerning what another individual might be thinking or feeling, usually called theory of mind kinds of tasks, and generally the medial temporal lobe network that has been known for a while to be very vitally involved in episodic memory, memory for experiences that we have had personally. So this default mode network seeming to instantiate remembering, projecting into the future, thinking about other perspectives, all that stuff that in meditation communities is often referred to as monkey mind, right? Where we're sitting still and not engaged in another task, what tends to happen? We think about the past, we think about what's going to happen in the future, we think about other individuals and how they're experiencing things and how they're experiencing us. All of those contribute to this constructed sense of self. And because of the important foundation in memory, linking the past and projections into the future lend to this sense of relative permanence, that there's something that is continuous through time. Now, neuroscientific studies have also suggested, I think, something that's relevant to this notion originating in Buddhism of anatman, or non-self. When Kazuaki Tanahashi was working on what eventually became this book that he published last year on the Heart Sutra. We had a number of conversations about how is it that neuroscience might use some of the sorts of statements that are made within the Heart Sutra. We're not going to have time this evening to go through the Heart Sutra, but it's a very central document within Mahayana Buddhism, and particularly important within the tradition of Zen. It talks about things other than the experience of self, but certainly very important in its implications for this idea of non-self. And so one of the things I had said to Kaz during those conversations was that I think neuroscience converges on a conclusion that no such things as selves actually exist in the world. That all that ever existed were conscious self-models that simply were not recognized as being models, and that the phenomenal self, the experienced self, really isn't a thing at all. It's a process, and it's a continuously changing process. And that's supported by observations from neuroimaging studies in the moment-by-moment fluctuation of these third-person correlates. Now, one of the things I want to be careful about is that sometimes when we talk about this concept of no self, it's easy to imagine that having a constructed sense of self is always a bad thing, and that the task of meditative practice is to somehow extinguish or get rid of that constructed sense of self. That constructed sense of self is actually quite useful to us. Very difficult to plan to how you're going to go to a restaurant after this talk this evening and have dinner without it. So we utilize that constructed sense of self to predict our own behavior and to plan our own behavior. And it also appears to be important for anticipating and predicting the behavior of others, something else that's quite useful. So, as the Grand and Ruby point out, they say, indeed, a close look at the literature reveals a striking resemblance between the cerebral correlates of the self and the cerebral correlates of reading others' minds at the brain regional level. Overlap in the anatomically based systems that are shown in those two different sets of tasks. So this constructed sense of self becomes important in how we're able to make sense out of the behavior of other individuals and predict what it is that they're going to be doing or experiencing. But is there a problem with the constructed sense of self? As Dambrun and Mathieu Ricard point out in a review that they did on these concepts of self-referential thinking or self-centeredness and selflessness, a variety of what they called shaping factors, some of them cultural, some parental, school, social role, professional, can all lead to a kind of inflexible reification or a making real of the self, which then leads to, because it's not founded on anything stable and real, a sort of happiness that's quite unstable itself, that's fluctuating, that's based on hedonic kind of satisfaction, not something that's stable and long-lasting. And also contributing to a decreased tendency to experience compassion and to engage in altruistic behavior. So consequences for how we are with others in the world. What's the alternative? Is there a different way of being able to see or experience self? It's been proposed that there really may be two modes of self-awareness, modes that in our normal day-to-day activity we may oscillate between without really being aware of it. One of them that's been referred to as the present moment self has to do with experience, as the term would suggest, right now, in the present moment, anchored within bodily experience, non-reflective, that is, not conceptual, overlaps with what William James described as the I of experience, and it's the self as subject, constantly changing process. That's contrasted with what's been called the narrative self, that is experienced over time. So it has to do with this movement from memory to projection into the future. It involves memory and expectation. It's metacognitive, so it involves conceptualization. It's more what James referred to as the me, and it's the self as object, a kind of entification and reification, making into an entity and making real, rather than seeing the constantly changing process. Now, as I mentioned, our typical moment-to-moment experiences likely mix present moment and narrative modes of awareness. And it's been argued by some that meditation training, particularly mindfulness meditation, may help to disentangle those two modes and might have the potential for revealing the brain systems that may be operating respectively in those. And maybe those assist us in some of that kind of scaffolding, how we might think about this. So, a couple of hypotheses. One, that meditation training may reduce the extent to which we're able to become or not get caught up in or cling to a self-focused narrative. And that those with meditation training might be more able to flexibly disengage from narrative self-focus and return to a present-centered experiential awareness, that sense of non-self or anatman that Buddhist teaching refers to. So I want to focus on one example because I think it instantiates the approach scientifically quite well. And this was a study for which Norm Farb was the senior author, conducted and written while he was still a graduate student. And the title is Attending to the Present, Mindfulness Meditation Reveals Distinct Neural Modes of Self-Reference. And so I'm not going to take a lot of time to go through all the details of the study, but basically they used an experimental task where their participants were instructed to adopt either an experiential self-focus or a narrative self-focus while they were viewing personality trait relevant adjectives. So words such as nervous, powerful, cowardly, energetic, indecisive, hopeful. And so this is what the instructions looked like. For the experiential mode, they asked them to remain present-centered, to sense what's occurring in their thoughts and feelings and body state from moment to moment, without any purpose or goal, just witnessing what's arising. And whenever they notice distraction, drifting off into some conceptualizations or memory or projecting into the future, returning their attention to present experience. So that should sound a great deal like mindfulness meditation practice. The narrative mode instruction, people were specifically to judge what was occurring, to discern it, figure out what the trait word means in relation to themselves, and to allow themselves to be caught up in a train of thought, in their thinking about what that means, especially in relation to self. And so what they observed, this is data that collapses across the mindfulness trained group and a novice group prior to any mindfulness training. That comparison group was then put into mindfulness training as a replication of this. But what they observed was, with narrative self-focus, in comparison to baseline, the regions that we would anticipate based upon what I had to say previously about default mode network appeared to be activated. both dorsal and ventral medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and of course, because this is a visual task in seeing words, primary visual cortex as well. So nothing very surprising about that. When novice individuals were examined and contrasts were done between narrative and experiential, or experiential and narrative, various subtraction techniques in fMRI studies, there was some differentiation for what's greater in narrative focus, these areas that we've been talking about previously in the prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex. However, what's greater for the experiential mode, having some of that activated, but also particularly bringing online this insular cortex, anterior insula in particular, where a great deal of somatic, bodily information is being processed. However, when they looked at the individuals post their 8 weeks of mindfulness meditation training, they saw even greater separation between these modes. So the meditators showed marked, pervasive reductions in medial prefrontal cortex in this experiential functioning mode, and also increased engagement of right lateral prefrontal cortex, the insula, secondary somatosensory cortex, inferior parietal lobe, all areas that are processing body experience, both from the periphery as well as from the viscera. Also, what they saw when they did a functional connectivity analysis, and this is simply a way of seeing what areas tend to co-activate, what may be functionally more linked with each other, that for the novices, those who did not have that meditation training experience, these areas that were representing viscerosomatic and cortical midline activations tightly correlated, correlation coefficient of 0.61. Whereas for the mindfulness trained individuals, those seem to be decoupled. So there could be specific activation of one and not the other, seemingly indicating that with this relatively brief mindfulness training, individuals much more easily able to move and stay within one of these modes or the other, a flexibility in being able to utilize that experiential self versus this narrative self. So, summarizing the Farb et al. Study, 2 modes of self-awareness in their respective brain systems. One, a medial prefrontally centered system involving narration and evaluative awareness of the self as object, and then another system involving right insula, right lateral prefrontal cortex, the somatosensory cortex, really a present-centered, present moment awareness of this I as embodied subject, involving these various somatic and sensory aspects of experience. So implications of work like this, mindfulness meditation training seems to be useful to help differentiate distinct brain systems that are ordinarily correlated with differential modes of self-awareness. So research now utilizing meditation as a way to better study the neural correlates of self-experience, to be able to differentiate them more clearly in studies. And also those with mindfulness training seeming better able to flexibly shift between those 2 modes of self-awareness and keep them clear. So in closing, I want to say just a few things about neural processes that may support that increased flexibility of self-awareness that may be occurring with mindfulness training. And here we move mostly into speculation because there really is not a good body of literature that specifically investigates all of this at this point in time. First thing that's relevant is that when we look at attention systems in the brain, there are really three major aspects. One, a system that's involved in a kind of top-down control of attention that involves the bilateral intraparietal and superior frontal cortices, that's involved in preparing and applying goal-directed selection of stimuli and responses. So this is our directed attention system. Another that involves temporoparietal and inferior frontal cortices, shown in red here, more right lateralized, involved in the detection of behaviorally relevant stimuli, particularly salient or unexpected stimuli, a kind of bottom-up attentional system. And then also medially, an anterior cingulate cortex and some of the adjacent ventromedial prefrontal cortex involved in conflict detection, error monitoring, attention switching, that which helps us know when we need to go from one mode to the other. Okay? Jim Austin, in his 2009 book, Zen Brain, Selfless Insight, suggested the possibility that maybe the so-called sudden enlightenment or Kensho experiences described in various Zen texts might reflect a shift toward this ventral or bottom-up attention system, and often in these stories it's triggered by some external stimulus, a rock hitting the bamboo, or in this famous story depicted in this woodblock, the bottom falling out of a bucket and this woman becoming suddenly enlightened. Perhaps in the meditation-prepared brain, a kind of sudden shift to this bottom-up, dominance of this bottom-up attentional system. More recently, Dave Vago and Dave Silberzweig proposed in their review paper that meditation may modulate self-specifying and narrative self-networks through an integrative frontoparietal control network. And they're really making reference to the same areas in this top-down and bottom-up attention system, although looking at it in a more elaborated framework and model where they're trying to look at various components in this particular illustration, a kind of open monitoring meditation process similar to shikantaza in Zen, or open presence meditation, and trying to look at the contribution of various different aspects of that as they contribute to, excuse me, again, this flexibility in shifting from one mode of experiencing self to another, and the degree to which we may be able to adaptively utilize those ways of instantiating self, depending upon what's demanded by the situation. And so the last couple of things I want to say is just to bring us back to what does this have to do with our actions within the world. Because in Buddhist practice, as well as in what we're concerned with in science, it's not only our own experience of unsatisfactoriness that we're concerned about, but the other side of that coin, if that's wisdom, the other side of that coin, how that relates to compassion, to how it is we are with others. John Daido Lori Roshi, in his book Invoking Reality, said the following: true giving means that the giver and the receiver are one reality. When giving happens that way, it's not about doing good anymore. The Bodhisattva does not practice from a distance. He or she is right there with those being assisted, covered with the same mud. They climb out together because self and other are not two separate entities. So this ability to shift to an experiential mode of self, very much linked to seeing that there really isn't separation, and that so-called other beings really not different. And so it's not me helping you it's both of us engaged in alleviating suffering together. And also, none of this ought to suggest that our focus on the self should be somehow disengaged from broader social and political kinds of concerns. In David Loy's most recent book, that's entitled The New Buddhist Path, he writes, the Buddha emphasized that what he had to teach was dukkha and how to end it. Did he have in mind only individual dukkha, or did he have a wider social vision that encompassed structural dukkha, the suffering inflicted on many people by oppressive rulers and other unjust social arrangements? And so this then becomes the bridge to what's been called socially engaged Buddhism. Not different, I think, from those more self-focused concerns about alleviation of unsatisfactoriness personally. So I'm going to end it there, and I think we've got a little bit of time to open it up for any questions or comments.